Today, we're going to discuss the rise of Assyrianism. What are we talking about? What is Assyrianism and what is Assyrian nationalism? What is nationalism exactly, as understood by various scholars, is a little bit different than what Assyrianism is. This is the definition that I give it and the definition that most scholars understand. So, first, I want to give a little bit of a background geographically when we talk about the Assyrian people. And we're going to get into the names issue today. But when we talk about these people, we're talking about essentially a one geographic entity here. We're talking about the area of Hakkari, Urmia, Tor Abdin, the Nineveh Plain, including the areas of Suldus and Salamas around Urmia and Shmizden in between Hakkari and Urmia. So all of these areas encompass the people that we are discussing today. They speak one language, different dialects. They live largely in a certain territory, although these days, as you know, there are different countries in these areas. There is Iran, there is Turkey, there is Iraq, there is Syria. I just came back from a trip with my sons and a number of other Assyrians touring the Hakkari area, largely abandoned today, the Tor Abdin area, and then the Nineveh Plain and Erbil area. All of these areas were really one, you could say, although there were different governments. Ethnically, demographically, one could say they were one. So the people who lived here, we label as Assyrians, Aramaic speaking Assyrians, or Syriac speaking Assyrians. And I want to begin with a reference here to the attempts at nationhood, the attempts that Assyrian nationalism put forth in after the First World War period, specifically in the Paris Peace Conference. Here you see a picture that kind of personifies the failed attempt to resurrect or to build the nation of Assyria on a political basis. You see images of members of the Syriac Orthodox Church. There in the center is Marafram Barsoum, who was calling for the rights of his people. You see images of Yuwil Werda and others from Urmi, what is today Iran. You see images of A.K. Yusuf, Captain A.K. Yusuf, who was a member of Syriac Orthodox Church, and others. Assyrians coming together from various locations to try to get something from the nations that gathered at the Paris Peace Conference. Now, it's important to understand what was going on at the Paris Peace Conference. 27 nations participated to build the future of the First World War period. This was, of course, not a gathering for the benefit of the Assyrians or for the benefit of any minority, but various items were discussed. The Assyrians, of course, in the end, did not fare well. Assyrians, in this political effort, which was sort of one of the last efforts being made by them to build some kind of a nationhood, in the end, the Assyrians received nothing. And A.K. Yusuf puts it well that despite all attempts, and of course, I've made this point, the Assyrian delegation was not on the same page. There are various grumblings between even, for example, the delegation from Urmia. They don't get along. They seem not to understand the political environment. I've referred before to the comments of Dr. John Joseph, who was a historian and referred to the demands made by the delegates as unreasonable and not connected to the realities on the ground at the time. So, in the end, the Assyrians received nothing. And John Joseph makes the point that, and of course, this comes afterwards, the leaders of both of these sects, he's referring to, unlike the Nestorians or the members of the Church of the East, who were dead set on obtaining something after the First World War, that they had realized they could not depend on the goodwill of the European quote unquote Christians. Of course, in this he is absolutely correct. There was no goodwill in politics, and the lack of sophistication on the part of the Assyrian leadership as a whole led to really, in the end, the Assyrians obtaining nothing. So John Joseph juxtaposes the lack of demands on the part of the leadership of the Syriac Orthodox Church and the Chaldean Church, unlike, say, the Church of the East's leadership, and says, unlike the Assyrian leadership in Iraq, the Arabic speaking Jacobite, Syrian Catholic, and Chaldean leaders proclaimed their unity and loyalty with the Iraqi government, emphasizing that they claimed no temporal power for themselves. Now, there's a lot wrong with the way John Joseph describes the situation here. The goal is not to get into this discussion, but I just want to say early on, everybody, all of the Christians, all of the Assyrian Christians that we refer to as Jacobites or Chaldeans or others, wanted the same thing. They obviously wanted something that was more solid, more protective, because they had all endured the genocide that took place during the First World War. The Chaldean community in Siirt, in Diyarbakir, and other places was almost completely wiped out. So they all desired something. But when they found that they're held hostage within these newly created powers, they obviously changed their minds about any type of nationalism that they felt would endanger their existence. And there's an interesting book written about the leadership of the Syriac Orthodox Church that is oriented toward hiding any references to a nationalism, culture, etc., and sort of Turkifying itself and making itself subservient to the needs and desires and goals of the Turkish Republic early in the formation of Turkey. And the same had gone on with the leadership of the Chaldean Church inside of the newly created state of Iraq. So, within this context, within the failed political efforts, what is Assyrianism? This is a movement that adheres to the continuity with ancient Assyria, with a focus on collective symbols and signs that communicate, specifically that are more non-Christian, to sort of rise above the divisive denominationalism and to reawaken the modern Assyrians to their ancient and glorious roots so as to inspire a stronger collective consciousness. It's about the three C's, to simplify: continuity with the ancient past, connection between the various peoples through these various communicative symbols, and about building a stronger collectivity now that the Assyrians do not have their own republic, their own country, their own homeland that is was tried but failed. Well, clearly we understand the divisions, the most prominent being, the most kind of on the extremes being the Diophysites, or the Church of the East on the one hand, and the Miaphysites, although known as Monophysites early on, the members of the Syriac Orthodox Church. these are two extremes within Christianity. Within them is for example, the Catholic Church and so on. But within the Syriac speaking, or say Aramaic speaking, or Assyrian speaking people, we have these divisions. And so Assyrianism strives to rise above this sort of debilitating difference. Now, Assyrianism is not, of course, without its opponents. So let's look at this idea that the people are descendants of the ancient Assyrians. And of course, it's criticized. One of the most prominent is John Joseph, who has written many times in various venues through books and articles about the sort of the bogus ethnicity, as one scholar calls it, of the modern Assyrians. And he says there was nothing Assyrian to be read and remembered. The time came when the Akkadian inscriptions on clay were meaningless to the great majority of the population in Mesopotamia. Well, that's factually could be correct. Tablets were not being read, obviously, but it's inaccurate to say that the tablets and the history and the collective memory was not a part of the collective consciousness of the Assyrians. Why? Because the image that you see here is the arches in Ashur, which was built. These arches were built during Parthian times, and there are archaeological digs going on now, and they're finding that the Assyrians rebuilt their temple. And although they were not reading Akkadian, that is very true, as John Joseph puts it, still, they did not feel that they were not Assyrian now that they were using Aramaic during this time, during Parthian times, and later during Sasanian times, and into the Islamic period, and so on and so forth, up until the present. They did not feel any less attached to their land and to their heritage. So it's not accurate to say that once they were not able to read the clay tablets written in Akkadian, all connection was cut off with the past. Certainly, certain aspects of ancient Assyrian practices and so on were lost, but that comes with development in history in any type of national narrative. So does it all end? Of course, as John Joseph said, and as others have repeated after John Joseph, some have written prior to Dr. John Joseph, the Assyrians have no direct linguistic or ethnic survivors, which is probably a mercy. And that's owed to the reputation that the Assyrians have, a very bad reputation that has been hoisted on the Assyrians by various scholars, largely based on, I would argue, a misunderstanding of the Old Testament. Some would say an understanding of the Old Testament. I would say a complete misunderstanding of the Old Testament. And one of them is anthropologist Carlton Kuhn, who was a little bit eccentric for various reasons. I don't want to get into it now, but he was all into, the shapes of heads and so on. Historian Stuart Easton has said that the Assyrians received no mercy as they had shown none. The very people disappeared from history, killed or absorbed into the population of the conquerors. You hear this often, that the Assyrians simply disappeared. And so because we're talking about Assyrianism and the development of this idea, I'm going to show you examples within the Assyrian nation who are sort of in agreement with this and come to the conclusion that this is an invented idea, a fraudulent idea. And of course, there are others. Yomatov is the author of a tourist book. These Assyrians who are not descendant from the ancient Assyrians are actually Nestorians. Misunderstanding, again, of a religious denomination versus ethnicity. But this is what the Assyrians have had to contend with. And my good friend, Dr. Odishu Melko, is one of the Assyrians that are writing and very active in sort of fighting back, has asserted with historical evidence, not simply being an activist, but also being an academic, has approached this through scientific evidence and has shown that there are many sources that show continuity. But people like Odishu Melko are not simply academics, they're also advocating a viewpoint, and they advocate Assyrianism. And when we talk about Assyrianism, I want to emphasize this. We're talking largely about a cultural movement based on identity. So, what is it based on? The evaluation of cultural, historical, and political identity of the Assyrian people. It emphasizes the revival and preservation of Assyrian heritage, language, and traditions, and sometimes revived traditions, such as, for example, the Chabnisan parade, artistic expressions, borrowing from ancient motifs. Key aspect of Assyrianism versus Assyrian nationalism, for example, and I'll get into more detail here. A cultural revival, efforts to promote and preserve the Assyrian language, primarily the Neo-Aramaic that is spoken today by all the Assyrian people, no matter what denominations. Literature, arts, and customs. Historical awareness, emphasizing the ancient history of Assyria and its contributions to civilization to foster pride and continuity. Religious identity, often intertwined with the religious heritage of the Assyrian Church of the East, the Chaldean Catholic Church, and the Syriac Orthodox Church. Christian symbols are encompassed within the Assyrian identity. So we'll see often the intertwining of ancient Mesopotamian or Assyrian symbols with Christian symbols. There is diaspora engagement, mobilizing the global Assyrian diaspora to support cultural and political goals, not necessarily political goals, but more cultural goals. It aims to unify Assyrians worldwide, ensuring their identity and rights are acknowledged and preserved amid ongoing challenges and displacement. Now, nowhere in here is the idea of a political homeland. So Assyrianism and Assyrian nationalism share related themes, but have distinct focuses. Whereas Assyrianism is focused on cultural and historical matters, has a religious aspect, focuses on global and diaspora matters. Assyrian nationalism is focused on political activity and political activism, unified national identity, activism, and advocacy on behalf of a political movement. Though I have to say, again, most Assyrian political movements today do not have a serious argument for the creation of a homeland. Now, if you agree or disagree, that's one thing, but the fact is that out of all the Assyrian political parties, no one really seriously advocates the creation of a homeland, an independent homeland. And that, of course, is how traditionally many scholars read nationalism. Nation should be at the center of our thoughts, our ethnic group or nation should rule itself meaning in a structured political way. As nationalists, we think that the best way to make this happen is to avoid control or oppression by others. Avoid control by others is something, unfortunately for them, Assyrians cannot do these days. The nation should have power. It should be independent. And that is not really inside the sphere of the movement that we call Assyrianism. And one of those who has pressed this point about political power is John Bruley in his book on nationalism and the state. The idea here is that nationalism is really centered on state, the creation of a state and power. And that certainly is not the case with the Assyrians. The Assyrianist movement or the movement for Assyrianism early on began with a focus um, on the idea that our culture, our heritage, our language should be preserved and we should be unified as a people, not necessarily on the creation of a political homeland. Now, within the Assyrian nation, I began by showing you a geographic image to show you how all of the Assyrians, all of these people that are Syriac or Aramaic speaking, and all of them happen to be Christian, surrounded by various Islamic peoples, view themselves as sharing a heritage. Within this entity, there are disputes. And the very person that I showed you that was at the center of the delegates that went to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 is the image to the right here of the screen, and that is Marafram Barsum, who became patriarch of the Syriac Orthodox Church. And he tells us, quote, the Assyrian name is an English Protestant invention going back to 1900 AD. It was bequeathed to the Nestorians in the regions of Mosul in 1919, 1920 for a malicious political purpose. The Syrians have no interest whatsoever in taking to themselves this strange name. Now, it wasn't so strange at the Paris Peace Conference when Marafram Barsum was advocating for some type of right, but it was strange later on after the Assyrians were massacred in Semele and a great fright caught all of the leadership. And of course, justifiably, everyone was afraid for their flock. And this turned out to be a mechanism by which they could separate themselves from those who were targeted by the government of Iraq after 1933. And so the leadership of the Syriac Orthodox Church decided, look, we want nothing to do with these people who have become victims of the Iraqi government. We do not even want to associate with the Assyrian name. And so he tells us the sufferings of the Nestorians have endured as a result of their nationalism. Nationalism is a very bad thing. And this theme carried on particularly among the clergy in the various churches, and that included later on the Church of the East, which had early on been a bit more vehement in asking for rights on the nationalistic basis. And along with the Syriac Orthodox Church came sort of a new movement that sought also to distinguish itself. But this new movement viewed all of the people not as Assyrians, but as Arameans, and recognized that there were members of the Church of the East and members of the Chaldean Church. But these, according to the World Council of Arameans, have all made a mistake as to their identity. Everyone is Aramean, largely because the language is Aramaic, therefore we are all Arameans. And so this is from the World Council of Arameans. As to the Council of Aramaic or Syriacs, we are dedicated to protect and secure the rights, liberty, and equality of the Aramean people, safeguard and promote the cultural heritage of its ancestors, ensuring justice and uniting all its people as a self-determined and internationally recognized Aramean nation. So, although there is no specific political plan here, uh, the political plan meaning to secure a homeland, there is this desire to bring together everyone under this Aramean identity. And so the Aramaic language, again, is important, and identity of our forefathers, our Aramean forefathers. This is largely based on a biblical understanding of history. The reference to Arameans is buttressed, supported by biblical references. And so that's a little more attractive to the church, specifically the Syriac Orthodox Church. And the World Council of Arameans has made good cause with the church, specifically the Syriac Orthodox Church. And in the end, therefore, we must see ourselves as one Aramean, well, in parentheses, Syriac body. So Syriac means Aramean. Syriac, the Aramean movement goes to great lengths to say Syriac does not equal Assyrian. Syriac equals Aramean. And the leading advocate, the secular advocate for the Aramean movement is Mr. Johnny Meso. And he tells us he's critical of the Assyrianist movement. He's critical of Assyrianism, does not accept it. He thinks, like John Joseph, it is not based in fact. More than 100 years ago, Aramean intellectuals dreamed of an Assyrian nation. And here he's referencing people like Ashur Yusuf and Freydun Turay and others. And a new Assyria. This elite formulated the political idea of Assyrianism in 1917 and introduced ways to make both Assyrians and an Assyrian language. The existence of the modern Assyrians, therefore, can be better understood by imagining how the following slogan just as easily could have come from the pen of one of the architects of the Assyrian movement. We have made Assyria, now we have to make Assyrians. Now, in this, he borrows this from an Italian nationalist, but Johnny Meso is a good advocate for the Arameanist movement. What I want to emphasize to you is that this is an alternative view to Assyrianism, but it is a unifying view. So the Aramean movement seeks to bring all of the people from the Church of the East, from the Chaldean Church, from the Syriac Orthodox Church into one Aramean identity. Now, within the Syriac Orthodox Church, of course, there are advocates of Assyrianism and not necessarily in agreement with the activists like church leaders within the Syriac Orthodox Church and secular leaders like Johnny Meso. And one of them is Bishop Dolabani, who was known to be an Assyrianist, and he was criticized for this, even very recently by other Syriac Orthodox bishops. But he did say, all our teachers taught us about the Assyrians, that we had a people, a country, a government, kings, and so on and so forth. And this influenced me. As you know, we were also cut down and slaughtered and became refugees. This also left its mark on me. As soon as I had mastered music, I began to express my umthanoye, nationalistic ideas. Again, no desire for a political solution, more a desire for a cultural movement. And among the members of the Syriac Orthodox Church here in the United States, the word Assyrian and the idea that there was continuity from ancient Assyria was certainly not rejected, but accepted by most people who were of the Syriac Orthodox membership in the Syriac Orthodox Church. And here you see some memorabilia, the Assyrian Mariaqub Religious Society, the Assyrian Patriarch of Antioch, and so on, and the membership of St. Mary Orthodox Church in New Jersey. Now, Chaldean nationalism, as it has taken form, and there are many uses of the word Chaldean, and I want to emphasize this right before I get into discussing the divisive aspect of this word that has come down to us today. The word Chaldean does not refer exclusively to, did not in the past refer exclusively to members of a Catholic denomination. The word Chaldean was used to refer to Syriac or Biblical Aramaic initially by Europeans. Later, it was used to refer to the Assyrian branch that came into communion with Rome. Among the Assyrians, the word Chaldea had a various histories. One history was that it was a reference to magicians and non-Christians. One reference was to the ancient past, but certainly not a self-designation. Eventually, it becomes a self-designation among all Assyrians, not only members of the Catholic denomination. So, for example, in Ochanos, it is used and it is a seal of the Marshamuns, the heads of the Church of the East that is not affiliated with Rome. It is used by such personalities as Mar Yonan or Rabban Yonan, who lived in Ochanos, who was originally from Truma. Um, he refers to Shita Yoneta, the Greek year, and Shita Chaldeta, for example, the Chaldean year. By that, he means the Christian year. By that, he means our year. So we have references from, for example, Marshumun Oraham in the 1800s, criticizing the Roman Catholic Church, saying, why had they given us this almsgiving by referring to us as Chaldeans, and now they refer to us as Nestorians. So the word Chaldean was not a word that divided the Assyrian people. In fact, it was used interchangeably with the word Assyrian. When it was used separately, it was used as a reference to both people, and you weren't really able to decipher who was Chaldean and who was Assyrian. So it's kind of like Somar and Ekkad, Kaldu Author, and so on and so forth. But as the Assyrian movement grew, there was a type of intellectual or religious rebellion within the Chaldean church, and whereas Freydun Bet Oraham, Freydun Aturaya sought to bring people together, people like the patriarch Mar Luis Sacco sought to divide his people away from Assyrians. Now, there could have been a political motive here. There could have been a desire for example, separate allocations um, of certain value, for example, for government stipends or government support, that brought about this separation on the part of the Chaldean church to be separated from the Assyrians. If the Assyrians, for example, were allocated certain seats or a certain type of income by a certain government in the Middle East, well, to obtain a separate type of allocation, one would have to separate. And so there is this desire to separate from the Assyrians and show oneself as separate because there is a separate entitlement. Now, early on, we see this type of thinking among people like Maramanul Delhi, the predecessor to Mar Luis Sacco, who claimed in his thesis or in his dissertation, we, the Chaldean, Assyrian, and Syrian people, are one people known as Aramean people. That was early on. Now, later, when push came to shove, as it were, and resources were at issue, the allocation of resources, Maramanu Dali took a different position, and he said any Chaldean who calls himself an Assyrian is a traitor, and any Assyrian who calls himself a Chaldean is a traitor. Now, imagine that. I mean, it's just interesting that a religious leader, um, who upholds a Christ who wants to bring people together saying something like that. It's just rather astounding, but there are, of course, political motives here, and we'd have to dig deep to understand what they are. But I think it's important to understand that the Assyrianism that we're talking about is opposed by some people, and most prominently by religious leaders within the Chaldean church, but not exclusively. And so we have a person who's tragically comical, Amr Fatouhi. He designates himself as an artist and as a historian. I have looked at his book. It's a. I mean, how can I be kind to make a couple of comments on it? It strives to put together a history which is not really based on sources. Um, it's based on speculation largely, and uh, and so his conclusion is that there is this proto-Chaldean nation that goes deep in the past, thousands of years ago, and sort of and then proceeds into the future all the way up until today, and it's misunderstood and maligned and so on and so forth. Here he is with this well-noted Iraqi scholar, Khaz al-Majdi. I don't think Dr. Khaz al-Majdi knows uh, who exactly he's standing next to here, but they're described as best friends and scholars for life. I don't know how scholars got in there. Certainly, one of them is a scholar. I think Khazal al-Majdi is definitely a scholar. Ahmad Fatouhi is another story, though. Okay, so what happened to spark the Assyrian movement? At the start of the 20th century, there were intellectual developments and movements, and these transformed the Assyrian perception of their identity. There were major changes around, for example, the town of Urmia specifically. I've studied this particularly, and what was happening was that Assyrians who had belonged to one church were coming apart into various denominations. Some had converted into the American evangelical movement, some had um, come away from their church into the Russian Orthodox Church, some had gone into the Catholic Church, but somehow they were all the same people. And so as nationalism swept, it was seen as a anecdote to this failure, if you will, this fragmentation on the part of the Assyrian community in Urmi specifically, but all in general throughout the areas that Assyrians lived. And there was at the same time the growth of education among Assyrians, and the growth of the schools and educations provided Assyrians with the ability to read works that were in Assyrian and English and other languages. There was a growth of literature, and Assyrians began to understand the world around them and the new developments and an understanding of ethnicity and identity much more than in the past. Whereas in the past, the focus had been on a religious identity. In the present, it was also on an ethnic identity that had intertwined with the religious identity. And so there was a call to unite the millet, to bring together the people. Of course, the millet system, as many of you know, was the system that divided the various minorities into religious denominations. But the Assyrians began to view the millet as something more than um, a taipa or a religious sect. They began to see it as a group of people that shared an identity, shared a language, shared a culture, a geography, and so on. And so this became a rallying point for intellectuals. This was an empowering move on the part of Assyrians, and there was a desire for identity to be strengthened and for people to feel that they were, although divided religiously, were one ethnically or nationally. Um, and of course, there was the influence of various other movements around them. The Armenians had picked up through the influence of the Americans and interaction with them. American evangelicals who opened schools in Harput and other places through European connections, and the growth of European nationalism swept the world, and Assyrians began to understand this and pick this up. And people like Freydun Bet Oraham um, made this statement: the nationalist sentiments umtanayuta of a nation increases when the youth know the history of this nation and remembers the deeds of his forefathers. When the youth remembers the deeds of his forefathers. So again, looking at ancient Assyrian past and taking a pride and using that to build confidence and continuity and a stronger collectivity among the Assyrians. Now, when we talk about Freydun Aturay, I'm going to get into his political program, but largely Freydun Aturaya, I would argue, was a cultural figure, much more academic, much more cultural, much more into history and poetry and literature than politics. But he did have a political side to him that some people found within the Assyrian nation to be a bit much. Um, so the first period of this movement among the Assyrian intellectuals was strictly a literary and intellectual movement. It was a desire to improve the Assyrians and to rise above denominationalism and to look into the past for inspiration. The past was seen as a glorious period. The past was seen as a unifying period, whereas the present was seen as fragmentary and undesirable. One of the literary sources that had a great deal of importance was the magazine Kukhwa. I cannot overemphasize how important this magazine was for spreading these ideas of Assyrianism early on in Urmia. It was founded in 1906, and it spread. It's difficult to know its exact circulation, but it spread, and it was the source where intellectuals were communicating with the rest of the population in the Assyrian language. Now, one very prominent article that was written in Kukhwa was by Benjamin Arsanis. And Benjamin Arsanis digs deep into Assyrian history and comes up with this article, Achnan Iwach Aturaya, La Suryai, and Chaldean. And he rejects these other terms. Now, by this, Benjamin Arsanis is not saying we are different than Chaldeans, we are different than Syriacs. He is saying all of us, whether we call ourselves Chaldea or Suryaya, should call ourselves Aturaya now. And he said, we do not know our name and do not strive to know it. And this made him angry. In the words of Yuil Baba, very qishya in his writings, very harsh. He criticizes Assyrians as being uncivilized if they do not pursue and if they do not pursue their heritage, pursue their identity, a deeper understanding of it. He says we are one drop but divided into many, one drop in the ocean but divided into many parts, We should be grateful for the discoveries of Westerners of Nineveh, Erbil, etc. Otherwise, we would continue with the same errors. We now know that we have roots, as all nations do. We are, in other words, discovering. Some of us think that we are descended from Arameans of Syria, and that is why we call ourselves Syriac Suraya, but this is a big mistake. They entered Mesopotamia at an earlier time. Here, it's important to know that Benjamin Arsanis was literate in a number of languages, and he was reading the writings of the early Western writers on archaeology, on these discoveries. Though Aramean language had an effect on us, it is not ours and is far from the Urmia dialect, which is true Assyrian. The name Syrian comes from our conversion to Christianity and its association with Syria, and taking the disparagement of the prophets of the Old Testament into consideration. In other words, let's not simply go along with the biblical interpretation of things. Now we should be much more scientific, as we see our neighbors becoming in the West specifically. From now on, we should take on the correct name of our ancestors. When we had existence, he says, Ituta, Khela, we called ourselves Aturaya, Assyrians. Now that we are weak and dying, we adopt this term that means ruin, Khrava, which is Suryaya. So he's opposed to that. Now, Kukhwa of Urmi, this magazine sought to bring together Assyrians. Remember, collectivity, connectivity, continuity, to show them their history, to have the ability to communicate with each other, regardless of where they were. And Kukhwa became a device for countering denominationalism. It is our intention to elevate the ethics of our people, to indoctrinate them into accepting the foundations and pillars that uphold our faith, which we accept without opposition. Hemanutan. Now, again, emphasizing the Assyrianism aspect of this movement rather than Assyrian nationalism. After the tragedy of Semele, the massacre of Semele, the Assyrian movement went underground in Iraq. But it's interesting to see what it is that they desired. There was a letter written to American diplomats who were visiting Iraq in 1945. And this letter asks for, quote, we may be considered a separate and distinct people, nation, which joined the Allies in both world wars and made great sacrifices, losing its political autonomous status. So, not necessarily a homeland, not necessarily a political arrangement, but simply we be considered a separate and distinct people. Remember, prior to the Semele massacre, this point was made through the representation of the patriarch Marishe Shumun. Again, that we may be considered a nation, not a denomination. We are a nation, we are not a denomination. And so this point was made again and again. And so the Assyrianist movement caught hold of the patriarchs of the Church of the East, and one would argue until now, as well as others, of course, but particularly the patriarchs of the Church of the East. Now, even with the formation of the Assyrian Democratic Movement in 1979, the focus had been on recognition of the Assyrians as a nationality and education, language, literature, culture, etc., and recognition that the Assyrians are a people, a nation. Because remember, prior to the fall of the regime in Iraq, the Assyrians were not recognized as a nationality, but were recognized as, in Arabic, a ta'ifa, or a denomination, a religious denomination. The only foundation of nationalism as such, the only condition that is without which no nationalism is possible, is an idea, Nationalism is a particular perspective or a style of thought. The idea which lies at the core of nationalism is the idea of the nation. So the core for a number of authors of nationalism is the formation of a nation, meaning a nation state or a state that encompasses the nation. And the point that I'm making to you is that Assyrianism, the movement is not that. It is not seeking to create a homeland. There's no serious argument on the part of any political party today. However, Assyrianism advocates the adherence to a culture, continuity, connection between people, and the importance of allowing this collectivity all over the world, as the Assyrians are spread all over the world, to be able to survive.